This is a reading of Exiting the Vampire Castle by Mark Fisher, published 24th of November, 2013. This summer I seriously considered withdrawing from any involvement in politics. Exhausted through overwork, incapable of productive activity, I found myself drifting through social networks, feeling my depression and exhaustion increasing. In quotes, left-wing Twitter can often be a miserable, dispiriting zone. Earlier this year, there were some high-profile Twitter storms, in which particular left-identifying figures were called out and condemned. What these figures had said was sometimes objectionable, but nevertheless, the way in which they were personally vilified and hounded left a horrible residue, the stench of bad conscience and witch-hunting moralism. The reason I didn't speak out on any of these incidents, I'm ashamed to say, was fear. The bullies were in another part of the playground. I didn't want to attract their attention to me. The open savagery of these exchanges was accompanied by something more pervasive, and for that reason perhaps more debilitating, an atmosphere of snarky resentment. The most frequent object of this resentment is Owen Jones, and the attacks on Jones, the person most responsible for raising class consciousness in the UK in the last few years, were one of the reasons I was so dejected. If this is what happens to a left-winger who is succeeding in taking the struggle to the center ground of British life, why would anyone want to follow him into the mainstream? Is the only way to avoid this drip feed of abuse to remain in a position of impotent marginality? One of the things that broke me out of this depressive stupor was going to the People's Assembly in Ipswich, near where I live. The People's Assembly had been greeted with the usual sneers and snarks. This was, we were told, a useless stunt, in which media leftists, including Jones, were aggrandizing themselves in yet another display of top-down celebrity culture. What actually happened at the Assembly in Ipswich was very different to this caricature. The first half of the evening, culminating in a rousing speech by Owen Jones, was certainly led by the top table speakers. But the second half of the meeting saw working-class activists from all over Suffolk, talking to each other, supporting one another, sharing experiences and strategies. Far from being another example of hierarchical leftism, the People's Assembly was an example of how the vertical can be combined with the horizontal. Media power and charisma could draw people who hadn't previously been in a political meeting into the room, where they could talk and strategize with seasoned activists. The atmosphere was anti-racist and anti-sexist, but refreshingly free from the paralyzing feeling of guilt and suspicion which hangs over left-wing Twitter like an acrid, stifling fog. Then there was Russell Brand. I've long been an admirer of Brand, one of the few big-name comedians on the current scene to come from a working-class background. Over the last few years, there's been a gradual but remorseless embourgeoisement of television comedy, with preposterous, ultra-posh nincompoop Michael McIntyre and a dreary drizzle of bland graduate chancers dominating the stage. The day before Brand's now-famous interview with Jeremy Paxman was broadcast on Newsnight, I had seen Brand's stand-up show, The Messiah Complex, in Ipswich. The show was defiantly pro-immigrant, pro-communist, anti-homophobic, saturated with working-class intelligence and not afraid to show it, and queer in the way that popular culture used to be, i.e., nothing to do with the sour-faced identitarian piety foisted upon us by moralizers on the post-structural left. Malcolm X, Che, politics as a psychedelic dismantling of existing reality. This was communism as something cool, sexy, and proletarian, instead of a finger-wagging sermon. The next night it was clear that Brand's appearance had produced a moment of splitting. For some, Brand's forensic takedown of Paxman was intensely moving, miraculous. I couldn't remember the last time a person from a working-class background had been given the space to so consummately destroy a class superior using intelligence and reason. This wasn't Johnny Rotten swearing at Billy Grundy, an act of antagonism which confirmed rather than challenged class stereotypes. Brand had outwitted Paxman, and the use of humor was what separated Brand from the dourness of so much leftism. Brand makes people feel good about themselves, whereas the moralizing left specializes in making people feel bad and is not happy until their heads are bent in guilt and self-loathing. The moralizing left quickly ensured that the story was not about Brand's extraordinary breach of the bland conventions of mainstream media debate. nor about his claim that revolution was going to happen. This last claim could only be heard by the cloth-eared petite bourgeois narcissistic left, as Brand saying that he wanted to lead the revolution, something that they had responded to with typical resentment. Quote, "I don't need a jumped-up celebrity to lead me," end quote. For moralizers, the dominant story was to be about Brand's personal conduct, specifically his sexism, in the febrile McCarthyite atmosphere fermented by the moralizing left. Remarks that could be construed as sexist mean that Brand is sexist, which also means that he is a misogynist. Cut and dried, finished, condemned. It is right that Brand, like any of us, should answer for his behavior and the language that he uses. But such questioning should take place in an atmosphere of comradeship and solidarity, and probably not in public in the first place. Although when Brand was questioned about sexism by Mehdi Hasan, he displayed exactly the kind of good-humored humility that was entirely lacking in the stony faces of those who had judged him. Quote, "I don't think I'm sexist, but I remember my grandmother, the loveliest person I've ever known. But she was racist. But I don't think she knew. I don't know if I have some cultural hangover. I know that I have a great love of proletarian linguistics, like Darling and Bird. So if women think I'm sexist, they're in a better position to judge than I am. So I'll work on that." End quote. Brand's intervention was not a bid for leadership. It was an inspiration. A call to arms, and I for one was inspired, where a few months before I would have stayed silent as the posh left moralizers subjected Brand to their kangaroo courts and character assassinations, with evidence, usually gleaned from the right-wing press, always available to lend a hand. This time I was prepared to take them on. The response of Brand quickly became as significant as the Paxman exchange itself. As Laura Oldfield Ford pointed out, this was a clarifying moment, and one of the things that was clarified for me was the way in which in recent years so much of the self-styled left has suppressed the question of class. Class consciousness is fragile and fleeting. The petite bourgeois, which dominates the academy and the cultural industry, has all kinds of subtle deflections and preemptions which prevent the topic from even coming up. And then, if it does come up, they make one think it is a terrible impertinence, a breach of etiquette to raise it. I've been speaking now at left-wing, anti-capitalist events for years, but I've rarely talked or been asked to talk about class in public. But once class had reappeared, it was impossible not to see it everywhere in the response to the Brand affair. Brand was quickly judged and/or questioned by at least 3 ex-private school people on the left. Others told us that Brand couldn't really be working class because he was a millionaire. It's alarming how many leftists seem to fundamentally agree with the drift behind Paxman's question. What gives this working class person the authority to speak? It's also alarming, actually distressing, that they seem to think that working-class people should remain in poverty, obscurity, and impotence lest they lose their authenticity. Someone passed me a post written about Brand on Facebook. I don't know the individual who wrote it, and I wouldn't wish to name them. What's important is the post was symptomatic of a set of snobbish and condescending attitudes that it is apparently alright to exhibit, while still classifying oneself as left-wing. The whole tone was horrifyingly high-handed, as if they were a school teacher marking a child's work, or a psychiatrist assessing a patient. Brand apparently is, quote, clearly extremely unstable, one bad relationship or career knockback away from collapsing back into drug addiction or worse, end quote. It perhaps never occurs to them that one of the reasons that Brand might be, in quotes, unstable is just this sort of patronizing faux transcendent assessment from the left bourgeoisie. There's also a shocking but revealing aside where the individual casually refers to Brand's, quote, patchy education and the oft wince-inducing vocab slips characteristic of the autodidact, end quote, which this individual generously says, quote, I have no problem with at all, end quote. How very good of them. This isn't some colonial bureaucrat writing about his attempts to teach some natives the English language in the 19th century, or a Victorian schoolmaster at some private institution describing a scholarship boy. It's a leftist writing a few weeks ago. Where to go from here? It is first of all necessary to identify the features of the discourses and the desires which have led us to this grim and demoralizing place, where class has disappeared but moralism is everywhere, where solidarity is impossible but guilt and fear are omnipresent, and not because we are terrorized by the right, but because we have allowed bourgeois modes of subjectivity to contaminate our movement. I think there are two libidinal discursive configurations which have brought this situation about. They call themselves left, but as the Brand episode has made clear, they are in many ways a sign that the left, defined as an agent in a class struggle, has all but disappeared. That's the end of part 1. If you enjoyed listening to this reading, I'd like to ask you to please make a donation to my channel. My PayPal's in the description. Part 2 of The Vampire Castle will be released within the next month. I've got a few more videos I'm working on. Again, thanks for listening. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Till next time. Bye.